Today, I'm going to be reviewing the NVIDIA 3060 and 3070, so let's get started. So first off, what are the specs I used to test these cards? So I used an AMD Ryzen 7 2700X, which is an 8-core 16-thread processor running at 4.15 all-core overclock, cooled by an Noctua NHD15 cooler on an Asus ROG Crosshair 7 Wi-Fi motherboard, which is on the X470 chipset. I used 32 gigs of RAM, two 16 gig sticks to run in dual channel mode, of GCO Trident RGB DDR4 running at 3466 MHz, which is apparently the maximum speed on the X470 motherboard that I have, with timings of 16, 19, 19, 39. Using an 80 plus gold 750 watt EVGA power supply. I have a 1TB Samsung 970 EVO NVMe boot drive and a 2TB SanDisk SATA game drive, where all my games and other tests are stored, so it's separate from the OS drive. Using Windows 10 Home 64-bit version 20H2 and the AMD Ryzen optimized power plan. So for NVIDIA, I'm using driver version 461.92, and I had 4 specific cards that I tested. First one was the Gigabyte 2060 OC with 6 gigs of VRAM. Next is the MSI Ventus OC 2070 Super with 8 gigs of VRAM. That's for last generation stuff that I have, versus current gen, which you already know, the Asus ROG Strix 3060 OC with 12 gigs of VRAM, and an EVGA XC3 Ultra 3070 with 8 gigs of VRAM. So let's talk about a little bit of my methodology for this testing. I only ran benchmarks, 2 synthetic benchmarks and 4 game benchmarks. I did that mostly because of time. I didn't have a lot of time. Well, theoretically I had as much time as I wanted, but I wanted to get these tests done as fast as possible, and I wanted to run tests that were repeatable, that you guys can run yourself and see how it compares to my configuration and for each individual cards. I also know that for a good review of a card, a graphics card, you have to be consistent and get good averages, as in if you're going to actually play the game, you need to actually play it more than just 5 minutes. You need to have 10, 15, 20 minutes to actually get a good variety of scenes and run times and all that stuff. For the benchmark, it's like a set time, it's the same every time, it's a lot more repeatable, so I thought it makes more sense to do those over in-game tests. I'm only looking at the average FPS, not the minimums, not the maximums, not the 1% lows, not the 0.01% lows, just the averages. Again, because I wanted to get through these tests reasonably quickly, but still hit the main points. I didn't apply any manual GPU overclocking, however, I did max out the power and temperature slides in MSI Afterburner because I think it's a very simple way to gain a little bit of performance without pushing the card to a point that it's going to crash. Obviously, I'm not using the ideal CPU for these tests. You don't want to use something that's current gen, a lot faster, maybe like an Intel 10900K or 1100K or an AMD 5950X, 5900X, but I simply did not have one of those CPUs. Is the only CPU I have, so that's what I had to use. The 3060 and 3070 are PCI Gen 4 graphics cards, however, the X470 chipset is a PCI Gen 3 motherboard. I do have 3 monitors, and I had all of them hooked up during the tests. However, of course, the game or benchmark was only running on the one monitor, which is an LG 27950 or something. It's the 4K 144 Hz, but I turned G-Sync off because it was recommended in some of the benchmarks, which makes sense. I also had Discord running in the background because it's a very common app people have, gamers have, that they're going to use, and I wanted to sort of encompass the average gamer, which is going to have your Discord running in the background and stuff like that. And I did not have an open test bit. I actually tested, in my current case, the Fantex P600S, which is this case right here. It has positive pressure, 3 fans in, 2 fans out. As you can see here, there's a cover for the side or the front and the top, but I of course removed those to maximize airflow. But the typical, tempered glass side panel, power supply shroud, full ATX support. Actually, I think it has eATX support. No RGB though. So now for the 1080p results. For 3D Mark Firestrike, which is the first synthetic tests, on default settings, just the graphics score alone, you can see how it stacks up here. So the 3070 outperformed my 2070 Super by about 31%. 2070 Super was 19% over the 3060, and then the 3060 was about 9% over the 2060. Moving on to 3D Mark Time Spy, again, default settings, graphics score only. 3070 beats out the 2070 Super by 30%, followed by 18% by 2070 Super, and 3060 is about 11% faster than 2060. Bright Memory is a very recent game developed by FYPD Studios, single person development team. Currently there is a demo version of the game up on Steam, it's about $10. Highly recommend. I personally bought it and played it on my old gaming channel, which I'm calling the Variety channel now. If you're gonna go check that out, I'll leave a link in the description below.
Here he comes.
There he is. Very fun. It's kind of like Dark Souls based. It has like enemies and stuff, and you have guns and swords, and you have like an exosuit on and everything. Anyway, it has a built-in RTX benchmark, and there's only about 2 settings. What level of RTX do you want, and what do you want DLSS to focus on? So for me, I chose RTX High, which is the highest preset. You can go for that. And I wanted to have a DLSS quality focus. So with that, the 3070 managed 86 frames, beating out the 2070 Super by a whopping 43%. As you can see, the 2070 Super and 3060 performed similarly in this test, and that'll carry on in the other resolutions for this game. So about 5% difference there, probably margin of error at that point. And then the 3060 beats 2060 by 33%, which is probably again those 2nd gen RT cores and 3rd gen Tensor cores really pushing those frames out. Next we have Rise of the Tomb Raider at the very high preset SSAA4X and VSync off. 3070 managed about 106 frames, which is a solid 25% over the 2070 Super, which is about 17% over the 3060, which is about 16% over the 2060. Next we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider with the highest preset. DLSS was on, ACR off, and VSync was off. 3070 managed 120 frames, beating out the 2070 Super by only about 7%, so not too much there. Although the 2070 Super did beat out the 3060 by 12%, which then also beat out the 2060 by 20%. So you can see diminishing returns there when you're going from 2060 all the way to 3070. So, and last test was Metro Exodus benchmark with the RTX preset, which is basically everything maxed out plus RTX. 3070 managed a respectable 76 frames, beating out 2070 Super by a good 14%, which also beat out the 3060 by 18%, and which had a 8% lead over the 2060. Now for 1440p tests, going back to Firestrike, 3070 performed 32% better than 2070 Super, which outperformed the 3060 by 20%, and then 3060 beat out the 2060 by only 10%. So almost a good 10, 20, 30% there increase each time. 3D Mark Time Spy, 3070 crushes the 2070 Super with a 35% lead, which then leads the 3060 by 15%, which beats out the 2060 by about 14%. Bright Memory, again, 3070 crushes the 2070 Super by 46%. And again, 2070 Super, 3060, small difference there, about 5%. And then 3060 crushes the 2060 by about 42%. So you can see this game is really pushing the RTX cores in these cards. And you can tell that by just the difference of 2060 versus 3060, which is like similar performance class for each generation, and the 2070 Super versus the 3070, just huge gains. For Rise of the Tomb Raider, you can see I saw a 30% increase from a 2070 Super to 3070, and then the 2070 Super beats out the 3060 by 18%, and 3060 beats out the 2060 by about 17% there. On to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 3070 beats out the 2070 Super by 14%, which beats out the 3060 by 23%, which beats out the 2060 by 26%. So again, diminishing returns with this game. And this game actually has a lot of interesting results later on as well, so keep that in mind. Lastly, for 1440p, we have Metro Exodus and a 30% performance boost from 2070 Super to a 3070 again. 3060 beaten out by 2070 Super by about 17%, and was about 11% over the 2060. So this is kind of like a reverse of the Shadow of the Tomb Raider, so you're getting more each time you go up. Now for 4K, the 30 Mark Firestrike sees a 38% advantage on the 3070 over the 2070 Super, which was 21% over the 3060, and which beat out the 2060 by 10%. For Time Spy, you can see there a huge gap. I saw it 44% going from a 2070 Super to a 3070, which holds its 14% advantage over the 3060, which beats out the 2060 by about 16%. So you can see in these synthetic tests, the 3070 just pulls away from the other cards, while the other cards are kind of just like scaling somewhat. For Bright Memory at 4K, these numbers are a little bit more skewed because of the overall low frame, so just keep that in mind. So you can see here the 3070 beats out the 3060 by 33%. And yes, I said 3060, not 2070 Super. 3060 actually beats out this 2070 Super by 1 frame. So again, it could be margin of error there, but as in previous resolutions, it was only about a 5% to 6% difference anyway, so. And finally, the 2070 Super beats out the 2060 by 55%, which is super high, but again, you're talking about 11 frames versus 17 frames. Kind of crap either way. For Rise of the Tomb Raider, we see the 3070 having a 35% lead over the 2070 Super, which beats out the 3060 by 20%, which beats the 2060 by 22%. For Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 3070 over 2070 Super by 22%, 2070 Super over 3060 by 18%, and 3060 over 2060, 36%. And finally, for Metro Exodus 4K benchmark, you can see these top 2 cards greatly outperformed the bottom 2 cards. So let's get into the exacts. 3070 was 35% faster than the 2070 Super. 2070 Super was 65% better than the 3060 at 4K, which I guess is to be expected. The 60 series is never really, meant for 4K, and honestly, the 2070 Super isn't really meant for that either. As you can see, the 3070 has a huge lead over it. But I guess if you want to go 4K on this game, get one of these top 2 cards. And 3060 beat the 2060 by about 23%. Now, interestingly enough, Shadow of the Tomb Raider in its benchmark also gives you a breakdown of how bound you are, like what's preventing you from getting more frames. It could be the CPU or the GPU. In my case, it was the GPU every time. So you can see here, at any resolution, the 2060 was the bottleneck, being 100% GPU bound at every resolution. Now, if you're going to go 4K, it doesn't really matter which card you get, you're going to be bound by the GPU. And for 3060 and 2070 Super, you're also going to be 100% bound by the GPU at 1440p. It's only when we get to 1080p that you see less than 100% bottleneck for the GPU. So the 3060 saw only a 90% GPU bottleneck. 2070 Super was about half that at 46%. And the 3070 was only 25% bottlenecked at 1080p. So huge difference there. Now I also want to throw in a little bit of extra stress on the system, but a typical stress, if that makes sense. And most people nowadays are, especially being at home, they might make some YouTube videos or they might stream, which just puts more load on the system, either the CPU or the GPU. And it's something I do myself, obviously. So I wanted to see how the performance was impacted by this. Now my assumption was recording and streaming might not exactly put the same amount of load on the system, it's going to put a load on the system. And I think it'd be easier to record multiple benchmarks rather than trying to stream that. And I think recording actually might be more demanding because there's a lot more involved and it's a lot more settings that I tweak. So specifically, I did a display capture and a webcam capture, same as I'm doing right now. So that's also not only trying to encode the stream, but also this webcam as a second video layer, which is a lot more demanding than just running the display or game capture. To save time, I didn't rescale the display. So like this display is 4K. So if you're doing a 1080p test, it like shrinks the recording down to like 1/4 the screen instead of filling out the entire screen because you're only using 1/4 of the pixels. Although in reality, you want to actually, rescale that and make sure it's taking up the entire screen. But again, to save time, I just didn't do that. Now for CPU encoding, I had a constant bit rate of 25,000 kilobits per second, keyframe interval 2, using the very fast preset, which is actually the exact same settings I use in OBS Streamlabs while streaming. So that's why I have those settings for that. Although of course, for my bit rate, I'm using 6,000 for Twitch. And for the NVENC encoder for GPU, again, constant bit rate of 25,000 kilobits per second. Keyframe interval was 2. I used the quality preset. Profile high, look ahead was on, psycho visual was on, and I had 4 max speed frames. And those settings were actually recommended by multiple sources I found. NVIDIA, some blog posts, the OBS guide, all basically said those exact same settings. So that's what I used. So looking at the 2060 first, you can see these green bars represents the baseline, base scores you saw in the previous graphs. The blue lines indicate the score while recording with my CPU. The red bar indicates the score recording with my GPU. You can see the average performance loss was about 20 to 30%, and I got better frames with my CPU every time. These are the synthetic loads, and here are the gaming benchmarks. However, I will point out Rise of the Tomb Raider at 1080p, Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p, Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1440p. I got less than expected frames encoding with my GPU, as in As you can see here, the numbers are close. However, in these tests, the numbers were a lot less than expected. And then recording at 4K, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I get more frames with the NVENC encoder, but by 1 frame. So again, margin of error. But you see this game is already throwing out some weird results here. Moving on to the 3060 again, static loads. I get more frames with X264 encoding. And for game loads, you can see here, recording Brought Memory or Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K, I get the same frames. While recording at 4K Rise of the Tomb Raider or Metro Exodus, I get more frames using NVENC encoder. Moving on to 2070 Super, again, more frames encoding with the CPU. In synthetic tests, and for game tests, again, same amount of frames recording Brought Memory at 4K, less than expected frames at Rise of the Tomb Raider 1080p and 1440p, and slightly more frames at 4K in Rise of the Tomb Raider. Now for the 3070, I got a higher score recording using the NVENC encoder at 1080p. However, according to the math, it's still a 24% loss in performance either way, because it's such a big difference from the baseline score. And in game tests, this one was really interesting. So Brought Memory at 1080p, bigger loss than expected using the NVENC encoder. Same thing with Rise of the Tomb Raider 1080p. Actually got more frames using the NVENC encoder for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. However, you know what's down here? For some reason, when I tried to run this benchmark, I couldn't actually get the game to run at 1080p. I had to do it at 1920 by 1200. I doubt that has much of a difference, but at 1200p or whatever you want to call this, I got more frames using the NVENC encoder. And same thing with Metro Exodus at 1080p. Although again, not a huge difference there. And same thing at 1440p. So let's talk about temperatures for a second. Now, I didn't actually have like a minute by minute temperature graph saved and then exported and all that. Basically, I had MSI Afterburner open on one of my other monitors to monitor speed and temps. And this is just an average of what I was picking up across the tests. So 2060 and 2070 Super stayed around 75 degrees. 3060 stayed at a cool 50 degrees Celsius. While the 3070 remained around 60 degrees Celsius. And again, this is inside the P600 case, not an open air test bench. So now if you were to take those tests and all the numbers and compare them to the 2070 Super, which is what I was running before I bought either one of these 3000 series graphics cards, here's how it stacks up. So at 1080p, the 3070 is roughly 30.5% better than the 2070 Super, while the 3060 lags behind about 20%, and the 2060 was about 30% slower. At 1440p, the 3070 is even better at 33.5% faster than 2070 Super. And again, the 3060 remains about 20% slower, and 2060 remains about 30% slower. At 4K, we see even a bigger difference, with the 3070 being a whopping 40% faster than 2070 Super. But yet again, the 3060 is about 20% slower, while the 2060 is 30% slower. So you can see across all the tests, the 3060 is a pretty good middle ground between the 2060 and 2070 Super. Now, I didn't want to throw much of this in here, but let's talk about price for a second. 2060, MSRP when I got it was about $300. I paid about $330, but nowadays they're going for about $700 at least. 3060, current MSRP is $330. I paid $520, but if you want to get it from a secondhand place like eBay, it's going to cost you at least $800. 2070 Super, MSRP'd for $500. I bought it for $509, and now they're currently going for about $800 or so, at least. And for the 3070, MSRP of $500, I paid $640. And if you want to get one of those today, they're going to cost you at least $900. So if you take the prices I paid for each of those cards and compare them to the overall performance at each resolution, here's what you get. At 1080p, the 2060 is the best value, although again, this was a year and a half ago. So, followed by the 3070, which is then followed by the 2070 Super, and then 3060. However, 1440p, the top two flip. The 3070 is a better value than the 2060, then again, 2070 Super and 3060 are at the bottom. And this holds true at 4K as well. 3070, 2060, 2070 Super, and 3060. If you were to look at the two current generation cards at MSRP, well, it's pretty obvious. It doesn't matter which resolution you're at, 3070 is going to be a better value. So when prices eventually steady out a little bit better, and you can get something near MSRP, 3070 is the way to go. And if you have one of these previous cards, you're thinking about upgrading, and you play, say, 1080p, well, there you go. And that has been my quick and rough review of the NVIDIA 3060 and 3070. This took quite a while, actually, to test each card across the 6 tests, recording each test's resolution twice. It took an entire afternoon for each card. So if you can imagine 4 different cards, that's 4 different afternoons, so 4 days. Plus it took a whole afternoon just to plan out how I was actually going to do this tests. And then I had to compile all the data, do all the calculations, percentages, make the graphs. So yeah, this is my first attempt at a benchmark video. Again, definitely could have gone better. Could have had a bit of a better setup and testing methodology, but again, I wanted to get through this reasonably fast and cover the basics while throwing some other stuff in there. So I hope you found all that interesting and helpful. Subscribe for more tech content, and if you're up for some gaming content, I have a gaming channel. Go check that out. Link is in the description, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching. Plus I took a whole extra, fucking hell. Plus I took an extra, I'm gonna fuck something.